Hello, everyone. I think it's time for us to get started in order to not delay the rest of the day any further. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on behalf of the Evans Foundation. We are one of the first and initial organizers of Difference Day, along with the VUB and ULB and Erasmus Hogeschool Brussel and Beaux-Arts. We've been organizing Difference Day since its first occasion in 2015 on the occasion of World Press Freedom Day. And we're very honored to actually host our own debate today, to which I'm glad to welcome you. And I hope some more people will come in once we start, but thank you for being here already. My name is Eva van Passel, so I'm Media Program Manager at the Evans Foundation. And I would like this to be a conversational panel. So you will see, that's the only slide you're going to see today. So get used to it, because it'll be there for a while. No PowerPoint presentations, no formal introductions. I just want to make it very clear that you are welcome to ask questions, and I will get to the audience to ask questions. But also, if while someone says something, you have an immediate urge to ask a question, do just wave your hand if you want to, and we can get to you. So the panel will be on how can we make voices of resistance heard? Because voices of resistance are very key in this year's Difference Day, and the different panels take a slightly different approach to it. Some really look at how voices of resistance are being oppressed. Some really look at how that happens in a really violent way, but also in the softer way. But we really want to look at what we can do to make those voices heard, and how can we ensure that there are strategies or ways of doing it without obviously ignoring the problems and without ignoring the difficulties in getting voices of resistance heard currently, but also trying to think a little bit forward-looking what we might do and what is happening to help these voices of resistance getting across. I'm glad to say we have 4 speakers here with us. I will introduce them very briefly, because I've asked them all to mostly introduce themselves and their work and the relation of their work to these voices of resistance and to the topic of today. But first, I will just quickly give you their names. Next to me is Justin Schlossberg. He works at Birkbeck University of London, but he's also chair of the Media Reform Coalition. So he's kind of has the academic hat as well as the activist hat on. Next to him is Marta Frišová. She's a Slovakian journalist and also organizer of the Central European Forum. And next to her is Sandra Kasavendic. She's from Belgrade, and she works for the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, Canvas, and she will tell you more about what they do herself. And then last but not least, we have Thomas Duprel, also known as Accro, who works at RTBF, the French public service broadcaster here in Belgium, on a digitally native platform that tries to reach young people called Tarmac, because young people, especially teenagers and young students, are an audience traditionally not very well served by public service broadcasting. And so they all bring a different angle to the topic of voices of resistance. But I will leave it up to them to tell you how they approach it. Justin, I think you can go first.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Eva, and to the Evans Foundation for having me and hosting this important discussion. I'm encouraged, actually, that the focus of the entire event today is on this central concept of resistance, particularly since journalism, real journalism, of course, has always been an act of resistance, a force of resistance to power structures. And I think that's probably more so than ever today. I think the old idea that journalists should be somehow, or can be, these passive, neutral conduits of information, I think has been largely dispelled, and for good reason. But nevertheless, we are obviously faced with all sorts of new challenges for having the voices of resistance audible. And I think that's also a key concept, because it is amplification that is the currency of what we might call media or agenda power in the new information environment. We know that simply because all of us are journalists. All of us have a platform and are able to have a voice. But we still live in a world where the power, that all-important publicity power, the ability to project messages that transcend fragmented audiences and niche cultural holes is really the preserve of a very small number of largely traditional, but also some new monopoly powers, what we might call institutional megaphones, whether that's the likes of the BBC or Google or Facebook. They are the ones today that still control the gates in terms of what voices, what information reaches those critical mass publics. So I think the first thing I would like to say is that the very kind of optimistic ideal that greeted the arrival first of the internet and second social media, that somehow this was going to solve all of our problems to do with concentrated media power, that new technologies of communication are somehow inherently pluralizing forces. I think that myth has also been pretty much dispelled. I think it's pretty clear that there's no reason to think that, for example, news consumption on Facebook is any more plural or diverse than it is on traditional platforms. But the other thing that I would like to just put out there as a provocation more than anything else is I don't think that we live in the kind of world that in which the power of voice has shifted predominantly or entirely into the hands of Facebook. I don't think we live in a world in which the phenomenon of fake news or so-called post-truth politics is entirely novel. I don't think we live in a world in which the sources of our informational problems and the forces and the reactionary forces to resistance are restricted to the Kremlin or Breitbart or indeed Cambridge Analytica. I think whilst there are some very real problems about the way in which far-right extremism is able to leverage its voice on some of these platforms and to distort the agenda, I think our first and foremost priority should always be those institutions that have that critical mass reach, the likes of the BBC, the likes of the national press. They are the ones who very often are complicit in the so-called fake news epidemic. They are very much often the architects themselves of fake news or the conduits of fake news. And I think that is where we should be concentrating our concern. I very much welcome suggestions that monopolies like Facebook and Google should be brought within the fray of regulation for pluralism, amongst many other things. But that our priority and our major concern is the way that very often journalists working for so-called mainstream professional news organizations aren't doing their job as voices of resistance or giving a platform to voices of resistance. Very often they are still, as they have long been and perhaps always been, doing much more the job of what we might call state stenographers, that is, reporting the often mistruths and disinformation that comes out of Whitehall or Brussels or Washington. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll get back to that. Marta, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Emma. I particularly liked the title of that panel, which is Stop, Listen, and Look. It reminds me a little bit on this famous slogan by Slavoj Žižek, "Don't act, think." He plays with the old Marxist imperative and sentence about how the philosophers so far thought or were thinking about the world, and now it's a challenge is to change the world. So he said, no, think, don't act. And this is because think in this to me means look for another perspective, not from the perspective you're used to. And this title of your panel has very much to do with the basic experience of my generation in the eastern and Central Eastern part of Europe, or of more generation of people who spent kind of half of their lives in a non-democratic regime, and another half in democracy. And the basic experience of us, or if I may generalize, of people who were trying to live autonomous lives, was that in those old times, you could be sure that whoever speaks in the true sense of this word will be heard, for sure. Because to speak required big determination. Would it be the philosophical determination of being aligned with your or harmonize say what you think, and be careful about your soul, as Jan Patočka said, the great Czech philosopher of the Charter 77 movement, or pure anger, whatever. It required courage and determination, because you could be sure that there will be consequences, that you certainly will be heard, even if you don't find any audience who would be aligned with you. But the regime will certainly hear, because it was obvious that if you have a regime that is based upon a more or less single big lie, every authentic speech imposes a big threat on it. And all the time, the regime is exactly aware of that. And then, probably the biggest personal surprise to all of us, how democracy looked like, that it's such a noisy environment that you suddenly could say whatever you wanted about the society, but no one cared, no one was listening to you. Yes, the dictatorship, there is always silence in a dictatorship, so that it's not so difficult to be heard. It became much harder in new circumstances, so that we almost forgot how dangerous it can be still. It's just that the dangerous things are not so much your thoughts, your standpoints, or your views, but sometimes it's just mere facts. So there was this morning some weeks ago in Slovakia when we woke up with the news that a young journalist named Jan Kuciak was killed together with his girlfriend. Was found shot in his home, in his kitchen, together with his girlfriend, an archaeology student. And yes, that was all of a sudden a voice who was silenced in the literary sense, in the most brutal sense you can imagine. By the way, it was not the first time that someone was silenced like this in Slovakia. There were cases before when people just disappeared. But somehow the society was not ready to perceive this. No one wrote about it. It appeared that these people maybe were depressed and committed suicide, whatever. So this was for sure not the first time. But for the first time, it was so spectacular, as if that should be kind of warning. And after some hours, where everybody, including me, who I'm a very slow thinker, realized what that means, what that meant. All of a sudden, there was silence. After a long time, around the country. And me personally, however strange, because I'm supposed to be someone who is interested in politics, I never heard the name Jan Kuciak, and very few people did. His readers for sure, but some of his friends, journalists, did. But I never read any of this article, and not anyone pointed them to me. I learned that he was an investigative journalist who was working on Panama Papers, and he also was excellent in working with open sources. And I knew these articles, and I learned are very complicated, because nowadays investigative journalism is a bit of it's kind of science. It's not so easy to follow. So they demanded me of some chemical formula, and I was too lazy to read them, to try to understand what this meant. So millions of people who never heard this name and who never cared about any affair or any corruption in investigative journalism started to be silenced, and so all of a sudden all our attention was with him. And the next day, on midnight, his newspaper put online his last article, his unfinished last article. This article, and then the next morning, all publications, all media outlets in Slovakia republished it. So that it was for sure the most read article ever in Slovakian history. And it was not, in fact, the basic facts that he mentioned were not new themselves. They were only more thoroughly researched and connected. The puzzle was more clear, and you could read it. It is written in a very sober way. You could read it just as a police report, but also as a comedy, tragedy, or even soap opera, because there is, among other players, also a beautiful young woman who made a rocket career from an assistant of a Calabrian businessman in eastern Slovakia to the main or the closest collaborator of the prime minister. So that was the beginning of an unprecedented civil movement that's going on in Slovakia still, right now. It's not over. It's far not over. It began with a huge march, a huge gathering some days after this, after the news, and initiated just by a young couple, a girl and a young man, who started just saying, "I am Katka and I am Peter, and we are going to marry, and we are both 27 years old, exactly as the murdered couple." So that was the beginning, and I would better stop now. and we may continue then.
Oh.
Thank you.
We'll get back to you on indeed the ongoing protests and the current situation. So, but first I'll let Sandra and Thomas introduce themselves as well. Sandra?
Thank you, Eva, for being such an attentive host. As Eva said, my name is Sandra Kachavindic. I work with Canvas Center for Applied Nonviolent Action Strategies. I am expert consultant and a trainer. I work with activists from all over the world. My expertise lies in working with training activists in how would mainstream media say in raising nonviolent revolutions. That is oversimplifying my work, but it sounds good for mainstream media. And therefore, I'm going to be short and concise. I'm an expert in working with activists facing very violent and oppressive regimes. And last couple of years, we had more and more requests from US and EU countries. And this is probably the main reason why am I here now.
Exactly, you summarized that very well.
Short and concise.
Thomas?
Hello, my name is Thomas. I'm known in Belgium as Acro because I'm a rapper for 20 years now. I'm working for RTBF, the national television and radio of Belgium, for 2 years now because they wanted to approach a young audience, and they did some specific marketing studies that said, okay, the young people now are more listening to hip-hop music, so that's why they were looking for somebody like me, a rapper. For me, the message in the songs is very, very important. For 20 years, I think that I always wrote what I wanted to say. I never wanted to make some playback things, only original lyrics, and it's really important for me. So I think I'm more positive maybe than Justin, because I think that it's a brand new opportunity for us in mainstream media to build something that look to be like a mirror of the today's society and to represent the youth. So I'm working with influencers, YouTubers, rappers, and I hope to give them freedom of speech in all contents, in all things they say. But yes, sometimes I have to carry look what they say and also have a journalist view and to being objective, not offense different type of people. So this is my role today, and I'm between two lines, between the line of somebody who wants to stay a rebel and say things like I want them to be saved, and also working as a professional journalist and big brother of the youth today.
Big brother of the youth. Now, one word that I would like to pick back up on to continue the discussion here is indeed the idea of making voices of resistance audible and some form of amplification. And in your case, Marta, you said that it's because the really tragic events happening in Slovakia that suddenly a voice that wasn't really listened to became amplified and the article got published everywhere. Obviously, it is not the idea that tragic events must happen in order to make voices of resistance audible. So I think that it would be good to discuss with this panel how else this can happen. And Sandra, for example, does this in very practical manners by literally teaching people how to prepare for activism and non-violent responses to violent regimes. But in light of Difference Day, because it's held on World Press Freedom Day, I'd like to get back to media for a moment again and just wonder, with this amplification, to which extent do does the panel think this current media landscape does offer perspectives for voicing resistance? And I think I'll start with maybe from a public service broadcasting point of view, because of Thomas's role, but also because I know that that's something that's contested in the BBC context. So I would like to hear the panel's point of view on how the current media landscape allows these voices of resistance to be heard and what the main concerns and issues are. I don't know who wants to start with this question. Go ahead.
If I can speak for public service, I think that they understood today that they have to have the mission of a public service is to serve all the publics. And so when it took maybe 15 or 16 years, 60 years to try to speak to the young audience, but it's a brand new opportunity to give, they don't know the codes of those young people. So I think for me, it's an opportunity to say, okay, you don't know how to speak to them, so let them speak by themselves. And some are really mainstream and pop and don't want to say anything against the system, but some are resistant too. And I try to put all kind of contents in the balance.
Mm-hmm. So the approach of making the voices heard is by making sure that you have different kind of approaches.
The first step of giving the youth a microphone to say what they want to say, I think, is a first step to permit a resistance to be heard.
There's a good example in the UK, I think, of. I mean, firstly, let me qualify what I'm about to say by saying, of course, even within the BBC, and I'm sure within European public broadcasters, there still exists genuine platforms for voices of resistance and indeed real good quality journalism. The problem that we faced in Britain, which I do think has parallels in other Western democracies, is that since more or less 2008, 2010, I think the financial crisis, we've witnessed a complete breakdown of the political consensus, that kind of center ground of what some people call neoliberal politics that had really held sway for a number of decades. And had very much framed and determined the way in which news organisations like the BBC, both interpret and apply their public service role, particularly on this all-important and contentious issue of impartiality or balance in news coverage. And I think there's just one very, very good example of how this has all gone very badly wrong and been exposed recently. In the BBC's case, there was a document that was leaked publicly, which showed how the BBC, this was in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, and just prior to the wave of resignations in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet of the Labour opposition, showed how that wave of resignations was absolutely orchestrated by powerful forces within the Labour Party in collaboration with the BBC. So, for example, one of the resignations, it was actually agreed with the BBC, would be announced live on air in a live BBC broadcast interview. And of course, that betrays the fundamental lack of independence in the BBC's culture and indeed its structure, because it's not simply a case that journalists are saying, well, we don't agree with Corbyn or this, new progressive left ideals or socialism or everything else, so we're going to side with the government or we're going to side with the right-wing Labour MPs on this. It's not that at all. Journalists believe that they're doing their job. They believe that they're being impartial, but they are structurally conditioned to follow certain agendas, to adopt certain priorities. So, for example, in the competition for news ratings and in the competition to be recognized as a news broadcaster of substance and worth in this 24-hour Twitterized news cycle, having someone having a shadow cabinet member announce their resignation live on air is a boon for editors, right? But it just shows the vulnerabilities and how easily journalists within these organizations can be manipulated and their public service ideals subverted by people in power, in government or in mainstream politics, or indeed in big business, who are able to do that kind of manipulation, or able to spot those vulnerabilities and get their voices heard over those of the resistance.
Right. Well, from a European point of view, we often talk about to which extent does the media landscape allow these voices of resistance, and the recent World Press Freedom ratings do show that there's worrying signs that it's really going downhill in a number of European countries. But Sandra, I know you also do work way outside Europe a lot with regimes where there is no single way in getting your voice across through media. If you work with, like you say, violent, oppressive regimes, then the media is not the place to start. So I would also be interested for you to tell more about where do you start if you don't start with the media?
In very oppressive regimes, media is actually one of the pillars of support of the regime. So what we call here fake news, they just call it like state media propaganda. It's like fake news always existed. Now we call them fake news, but before, military, that was a term calling spreading disinformation. Mm-hmm. So they use media to indoctrinate, to twist, reality. And when I train people, we teach them how to use every tool in the box to steal their own media space. If every news outlet is state-owned, then you need to find out where do people can gather in the market, or use earth writing, sky writing, radio amateurs. You need to first do analysis of the population and demographics of the country. In some countries, you cannot just launch an internet campaign because most of the population just still listens to the radio. And in EU, we tend to get, EU countries tend to, in my opinion, take the democracy and their freedoms for granted. So I recently spoke with people from EU countries, and every idea ends up with mass protests. And everything is a riot and a protest. I work with activists who cannot protest because their lives are in danger. So the protest is the last weapon in the toolbox, or the tool in the toolbox. So living in established and old democracy, where you have so many options, and you just come out and protest for everything, it's I don't want to blame media and sensationalism, but how long before pictures of dead children will stop shocking us? How long before we just become so
desensitized to protest, basically.
And then we have I go and work with people who have no means to report because their lives are in danger. So if they see the Europe and the free world having the same problem, it is very and not finding a solution, it is very disappointing to them as well. Mm-hmm.
So, Marta, I know you wrote recently about, when you wrote about the protests in Slovakia as they first emerged, which is now, I guess, a month and a half ago, more or less. I know that you gave examples of other EU countries, but countries in general, where we have seen mass protests that haven't actually led to any difference in regime. So there are a number of examples of for example, in Romania, where protest is so regular, but the corruption in the regime doesn't seem to really get solved. It's just one of many possible examples I could give, I guess. But in the article that you wrote, you sounded hopeful that it might be different in Slovakia. And ever since I read it, I have wanted to ask you, what about now? Are you still hopeful that these protests are making a change, or how do you see it?
It's still undecided, and I don't think there will be ever a definite victory. But like, by the way, speaking of public service and public media, we are just confronting the destruction of any kind of the slightest degree of independence of the Slovakian public service, which, yes, this is a new development. It seems to be quite brutal, you know, because Slovakia is at the moment it's a small but interesting, strange laboratory. We're certainly not the case of Hungary, where all the media are state-owned, because Viktor Orban slowly and systematically bought them over the year. In Slovakia, there is no censorship in that sense of the word. It's a country of free press. The public service was always was never, or it would not be new that it would be owned by politicians. But in the last year, it was really independent, and it was getting, especially the news, were getting more and more credible. But so that nothing is decided yet. The protests were effective because they were so unexpectedly huge and took place not just in Bratislava, but in all the regions, about 30 cities, and also people abroad were protesting synchronously at the same time. So in the symbolic level, they really were successful, because the Prime Minister stepped down, and which was nothing that we could ever expect from him. But the pressure was so big, and the Minister of Interior, originally a very popular man, was also stepped down. But the politics is the same, and so this is now another challenge: how to proceed. What can a civic movement do in a moment when this political force has still a majority? So from the constitutional point of view, they still have a very high amount of percent. However, what is going on is unacceptable. And so it is a dilemma that has no clear answer. Of course, they're getting accused that they're helping the opposition. However, they try to do what they can to distinct themselves from the opposition. The opposition is another tragedy for Slovakia, because it is a kind of nationalistic, neoliberal entity, the strongest part of the opposition, which is also a phenomenon that is not only strong only in Slovakia. So that we have yes, in a way, this is interesting. Just as an example, that you have kind of two bad options, two bad alternatives, and the symptomatic thing, where the only thing that we might call hopeful is the character of the protests themselves, and it's only organized by young people. It's occurred that no one else would be credible enough to gather such crowd, to mobilize such crowd. They have no ideology. They are very diverse. It's a very diverse group. There are also very conservative young people. There are all kinds of young people. And it's a very small group. And the first day, they have to decide how to call themselves, how to call this. And they said, let's call it, it's a movement for decent Slovakia. And when I asked them, how did you come to that idea? I said, we didn't know we had just 5 minutes to think about it. So we thought something like normal Slovakia, something we can agree on. Like
define decent.
Yes, define decent. So it's decent Slovakia, which is strange because it's a very, it's not for just Slovakia. It's like as if they would read Avishai Margalit's book. Maybe some of you know that notion. He argues that it's that decency for the future or for the present is more tangible, is more important than the notion of a just society, because decency means not to humiliate anybody, a society that is not humiliating. So that with the help of this word, the spirit becomes we need more decency also among ourselves. So everybody has to be more decent. This is the main spirit of the protest. So in short term, this doesn't need to have a good and happy end at all. But in long term, we already have this experience that a small society like ours needs the experience that remains in the tradition. And you can see that it's exactly many things, many mechanisms looks very much the same like those in '89. However, these kids could not remember that, like ringing the keys and other things. Yes, like and exactly this non-violent and decent tone of the protests. That it can be something. It creates already an environment for different culture, in society, for different political culture, and this is already obvious that this will be the case. So in long term, I'm very confident that this has a huge meaning. Short term, I don't know.
Okay. So yeah, decent Slovakia is not a slogan you would imagine that young people would have come up with. It's indeed a bit unexpected, but also I guess indeed it's an easy. It's hard to be against something like that, but yeah, it's and define decency.
Yeah, it would be undecent to be against.
And the public TV people, the prevalently young reporters of the public TV news, they started to wear badges with the portraits of the young couple, or with this decent Slovakia, and this was the first thing that the new boss forbid, so they are not allowed anymore, and also step by step they kicked out. They're getting fired. So in the moment, this is quite crucial if the public will be able to stand for the public broadcast. It's a question. So I think tomorrow tomorrow there will be a protest in front of the building of the radio.
Okay. Thomas, I guess from your point of view, the youngsters that you serve with your program don't really call for decent Belgium.
Absolutely not.
A different point of view.
No, I like that kind of approach, the concept behind the word, and it says a lot and it says nothing. It's political correct, but it means that they find nice words to prepare a future, and that's a good point. Yes, but no. We will not make a decent Belgium movement.
Okay.
I think.
I have a lot of questions still, but I do want to make sure that we give chance to the audience. I know there's not many of you, but don't be shy. That also means not many people hear you ask the question. So I would just like to see first if anyone has a question at this stage, and also would encourage you to ask each other questions if you want to, because that's something that I find never happens enough on panels. So are there any questions in the audience for the moment? No, only silence. Only shy. Okay.
They're so decent.
Sorry?
They are so decent.
Yes. It's, in Belgium we don't do decency. Okay, I will go back to an open question that I think can apply to all of you then. And this is which successful strategies for voicing resistance or amplifying resistance or making sure it gets heard have you encountered in your work? And I know that, like you said, Sandra, it can be very dependent on context, on what is successful and what not. So I don't think we can get a one solution for everything. But I'd like to know, if you also tell the context, which strategies for voicing resistance have you seen that you have thought worked?
Well, first of all, to younger generations, they should, the best strategy is going from online to offline. I spent days of training.
To combine both, yeah.
Yeah, well, new media is very effective in spreading your message or even maybe recruiting people. I mean, ISIS did it. And, but, you know, actually you have to stop and think, how many elephants did you actually save by clicking the link? You're not activists saving elephants by clicking on a link unless that link pays some security agency to have guards around the elephant. So you have to have a person between a poacher and an elephant, actually. So, you know, clicktivism is a new thing that's very popular, but that's not really an activism. Young people have to know that what they start online and, you know, getting a lot of supporters, they have to finish offline. They have to actually get out and do something. I don't say there have to be riots and they shouldn't be violent, but there are a lot of things they can do offline that are not violent, of course.
Okay, anyone else wants to tackle that question? Successful strategies you've encountered?
I did a recruitment of a YouTuber who has 400,000 of people following him, but he was not he had all expression he wanted to say on his YouTube accounts, and then he came up to the media, and yes, it was very difficult because I was a support of him because I wanted him to say all he wanted to say, and he wanted to keep that. But it was also difficult because the boss of the info is looking at every video he's producing to be sure that he was not insulting people or saying things against genders and things like that, because his religion is Islamic. His name is Abdel en vrai. So it could create a kind of cultural clash, but for the moment, everything is happening good. So this was a strategy for us to reach the young audience, but it's also a risk because we give people to that guy the freedom of writing and saying what he wants to say. He can use every subject he wants to talk about, but we also work with a journalist, a young journalist who's also affiliated to the hip-hop culture, and we're trying to make the best of his thoughts and things.
Okay.
I don't have much really to offer on strategies as such, but I do think, firstly, it's important to draw a distinction between different meanings of the word resistance. The late, great Professor Stuart Hall reminds us that the first sight of struggle, of resistance, is always over meaning. And I think, you know, we live in an age where the very rhetoric and discourse associated with resistance to structures of power, to elitism, to the establishment has been deeply co-opted and manipulated by right-wing forces. And to the extent where one of the kind of complexities of this struggle is that we're not just fighting against those dominant centralized institutions like public service media that, as I said, still have this commanding reach. but also against this rhetoric that comes from the likes of Trump and Farage that somehow positions them as equal outsiders, that they are equally maligned or mistreated by those institutions. And of course that gives the kind of catch-all defensive response from the likes of the BBC and Defensor, which is, well, if we're pissing off people on both sides of the fence, then we must be doing something right. The problem is, when you kind of scratch beneath the surface of that rhetoric, it's very clear that the ideologies represented by, and I think it's pretty safe to say nowadays, the far right, and ideologies predicated on xenophobia, on anti-immigration, on essentially uber capitalism. These are ideologies that have been given central, major platforms for decades, certainly in the UK, in the national press, and in broadcasting. So it's absolutely not the case that they have been maligned in the same way as progressive forces or voices of resistance. But the last thing I would say, which relates more closely to the question, is, and this really checks some of my initial pessimism, if you like, but I do think there are opportunities in what we call liberal democracies, and I put that in inverted commas for the reasons that partly for the reasons I've been talking about, but there are nevertheless opportunities opportunities for voicing resistance that do distinguish these societies from more authoritarian regimes, including those within our own European borders. And a classic example of that in the UK is the 2017 general election, which was an election unprecedented in so many ways. It was called with an unprecedentedly short time frame for campaigns. And even within that period itself, we had an unprecedented spate of vicious, deadly terrorist attacks, which were obviously not a coincidence. And so the opportunities, the windows for democratic debate ahead of that election were unprecedentedly small, unprecedentedly narrow, and yet, because during an election, the likes of the BBC are subject to particular rules about impartiality, because an election does create the opportunity for parties, all major parties, to have a voice and to put forward policies, and actually is the only time really that professional journalists are compelled to talk about policies rather than frame politics purely as this kind of a theatre of infighting and personality conflicts and all the rest of it. Even with that incredibly narrow window, there was something of a meaningful public debate about what should be done with the myriad crises that we face in health, in housing, in everything else. There was actually a real debate. The news was actually informing people of what policies were on offer by the different candidates, by the different policies. Now, as it happens, that debate also coincided with one of the most dramatic shifts in public opinion polling that has been seen in modern British history, whereby the Labour Party went from almost a complete outsider, and it was almost a foregone conclusion that Labour will be wiped off the electoral map, to winning its biggest share of the vote since Tony Blair's first election in 1997. And I think that tells us a lot about what are the opportunities for voicing resistance, particularly in those periods.
Thank you. I think you've touched upon a kind of without mentioning the word, on the idea of populism, and indeed that is really something that presents itself as resistance, and especially in the case of Donald Trump, for example, very much as an anti-elitist voice, even though he has almost literally a tower made of gold. Still, like, I'm not the elite, I'm not part of them. That's sort of a populism presenting themselves as resistance. And I would like to know more about how you see these dynamics, and if you think that there's a way to address this in a sense that if citizens identify with the rhetoric that the populist politician is resistance, then how do you engage with that, and how do you address this? Does anyone want to say something about these dynamics?
Well, yeah, I'm hearing about it a lot lately, like populism is going to eat the heart of Europe and destroy everything, and so on and so on. Honestly, I'm starting to believe that Donald Trump came to power just because he's so ridiculous and it's more fun to watch on TV. And it's entertaining. Yes, populism is maybe a serious threat to democratic institutions of Europe, but it's our own fault because of that, and we couldn't just leave democracy to politicians and let them guard it for us. I mean, Kemal Atatürk left democracy to be kept by army in Turkey, and see how that turned out. And yeah, we all need to be involved, but I wouldn't sound apocalyptic or raise a panic. I mean, populism is just a trend, and it's like a cycle. So there are different layers. We didn't come to the end of development of democracy. This is not the best you can get, and then, just guard it. We probably should think how this happened and how it started, and make adjustments and changes so we could save the EU and democratic institutions from this past. I would call them pests, and it sounds insulting, but I don't want to. If you give them, they like to take themselves seriously. I teach people to use humor in resistance to the oppressive regimes, and so I wouldn't take them seriously, and they wouldn't like it probably.
Okay, so humor and other strategies to voice resistance in a less serious way, and not just trying to shout the loudest, but trying different tactics. Yeah. Okay. So I think that touches upon some things that, for example, Thomas, you do in your work is that voicing resistance doesn't always have to happen through serious news media. You can indeed do it through arts, through entertainment. Artivism is a thing, art is activism, and using entertainment to get dissonant and different messages across. I think that's maybe also a good way of humor, indeed. Yeah.
Yes. I think humor is still one of the best weapons we have, because you can make an animation without speaking, but the fact that you turn a political news into something funny, but the youth can get the message, but also can get a second way of writing the info, and I'm trying to work on this too, yes, the humor.
Yeah, because the people at power, all kind of, yes, with the thing of cynic, neoliberal elites, whatever, and the populists have something in common, and to me it's that they're all really ridiculous. It's not so difficult to make fun of them, and so you can see in this demonstration how people enjoyed making jokes, how creative people were all of a sudden, old and young, with the banners and pictures and so on. But yeah, originally I wanted to share that I just read, I think now, an hour ago, an old article by Mark Lilla, that liberal that saying a banal and conventional wisdom that we take liberal democracy, our generations take liberal democracy for granted and have not this experience of the 20th century, that how fragile this is. And this is because citizens, we are not born as citizens, and citizens must be raised, and citizens must be trained, educated, whatever. This is how a human being becomes citizens, and that liberal democracies are failing. Why are they failing? Basically, because they teach us how to make politics in a legitimate way, but this is a very modest goal. It's not enough. So I thought to myself, how true, especially for us, because of course in the 80s, at the end of the 80s, when all this old regime failed, we hated all kind of, we hated everything that was somehow bound with the word collective. Everything collective was imposing dictatorship and limiting freedom, so that we naturally tended to neglect that there is also something as a society. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the first or strongest attempt to come back to that we have to be a society. Otherwise, a society that is created by citizens. Otherwise, it can be only created by slogans that don't recognize citizens and recognize only people. Yeah, the popular, the populist.
The more passive version. The more passive version of citizens, not the active.
So that this is a beginning of all kind of fascism, and these are the, as you said, so to say, the other all of the false resistance that means to let's be people, let's not be a society.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting that this discussion around the word populism, because for me it raises the important question as to, what is really popular in terms of solutions to the crises we face and the challenges we face across, economics, politics, our social lives, etc. And I think there's a long history in Europe, especially, of course, many people voted for Donald Trump because he was entertaining. Many racist extremists voted for Donald Trump because they thought that he was going to, make America and white people great again and whatever else. But I actually think that the reason why Donald Trump got elected, the reason why Brexit happened in the UK, is because that their campaigns tapped into and manipulated something that is actually fundamentally progressive in public opinion, in populist sentiment. And that fundamentally progressive thing is that most people, and polls show this, good quality polls, a good quality survey done on public attitudes have shown this going back generations, that most people want a society that is socially just, that they are against extreme forms of austerity, that they are against wars, certainly unnecessary wars. And these basic, fundamentally progressive sentiments were being brilliantly co-opted and exploited throughout history by those who sought to explain away the society's ills by providing scapegoats, largely in the forms of immigrants, of minorities, etc. That's exactly what Hitler did. That's exactly, and I'm not drawing direct parallels here between fascism and the Trump regime or anything else, but it's very, very clear that populism has been distorted. So I think we're on dodgy ground when we talk of populism in this kind of derogatory, way, as if to say, well, if something is popular, it must be stupid or banal or not actually in the public interest. I think fundamentally what people want is in the public interest, it's just distorted.
Okay.
Yes. And also, but people were grossly disappointed by the other side as well. I mean, they tapped into that heavily. So, yes, and we saw the mainstream media persuading us that Hillary is going to win until the last moment, that she has over 80% of support. And I didn't see anyone, really accountable for, such a, fake news. I mean, they were actually, and we can debate about Trump, why did he win, but for me, there was a huge gap created between intellectual elite and rest of the population, a lot of them were supporting Sanders and Clinton, and they had totally disregarded the opinion of the other part of the population, which Donald Trump know very much about, being a reality TV star, and he knows exactly who are his viewers and how they think, and so he used the mistake of Democrats as well. And Hillary tried to go to his arena and fight him on his ground, and that was a big mistake. And
Okay. I'm going to turn once more to the audience in the hope that someone has a burning question. Aha! I think there's a microphone at the back that might be easier for us to hear you.
Hello. My question is for Thomas Duprel. I'm Belgian, I'm 26, so I know you. And my question was, in your work with youth, do you think they really resist? I mean, in the context of Belgium, where we're not in an authoritarian country and so on, don't you think they just escape and don't engage with mainstream media at the moment, and are in another bubble simply, and do they want to be heard by us, or do they want to do their own thing rather? And isn't that the issue in this context? I don't know if you have any thought about this.
I don't get the question right.
The question is, do you think they resist? Like, the youth you're working with? Who are you
talking about?
The youth that RTBF wants to reach out to.
No, I don't think. The way I'm listening to the debate today is people like both of you who suffer from freedom of speech in the past in some countries, and I think we still have the youth. They want to be heard for their lifestyle, maybe, but not especially for their political views today. And I think that maybe they don't have any more illusions about changing the system. So yes, they are more material. Yes, they want more fun. Yes, they do drugs, they do sex without protection. Because in the 90s, I think my generation was, they had a lot of campaigns against ads and things like that. And today, I think they are more conservative than ever. And yes, it's a problem, but it's the fact that they are like that. And when I work with youth people, they will more speak about having fun than changing the system. But they have opinions over the system, but I think that in music, they know that when you have that type of changing between Obama and Trump, it's like the world is collapsing. And so, okay, if USA can put the first black president on top with all white people following him and starting to change the health system, and then it goes down with another one who's more like KKK, okay, what can we do for the youth? I think they say, okay, what can we do in the small Belgium to change the world. So, okay, let's have fun. The priority of the youth today is having a job. Some of them are studying 5 years in university and don't get enough, don't get anything. So I think they have things to say, but first they are not naive anymore about the system. And I think there's a big change between, today it's 15 years of, between 1968 in France and 2018 today. And I think between two generations, it's not absolutely not the same way of thinking, with resistance, fighting a good place at school. They know that their parents fight for that, and sometimes they get something, sometimes they get nothing. So I think they are more realistic than ever. But it's my point of view.
No, like realistic or pessimistic.
So young people don't necessarily always want to be citizens in the active sense.
Yeah, but in Belgium we have a social system that if you are poor and homeless in Belgium, it's because of a catastrophic way of life, of you didn't have any chance, but there's a social system that keeps people up. So I think that more you are confronted to a radical system or political system, more you can be against the system. But yeah, there are things to do, of course, to be in a better system in Belgium. But for today, I think someone who wants to study, well, he can find bourse, he can find money. Someone who wants to work hard, he can touch his dream. Yes, it's possible. So
Okay.
maybe you don't agree with that.
No. What's interesting is the experience, I think, in the UK is completely different. Recent experience.
Yeah, because the system, I think the American and English system is more like, do something or you're gonna die tomorrow. If you don't work, you don't get something. In Belgium, we are still more comfortable than.
Well, I think it was very
socialist.
similar a few years ago. We had the London riots in 2011, I think, and that was widely framed as something that was apolitical, right? Because young people were just basically looting shops and getting the best trainers and the latest TVs and whatever else, right? And at the time, some people were saying, well, hang on a second, that is actually in some ways a deeply political statement. You know, it's fuck the system and whatever else. But the thing is, what really, in hindsight, what really kind of typified that period in British politics was that there wasn't an alternative within mainstream politics. We were still very much in the age where you had all of the major parties, for all intents and purposes, singing from the same hymn sheet, which is, which was austerity, 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 war, austerity, austerity, austerity. There was no alternative.
Yes.
And now, what has happened since Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party is that young people have been flocking to the Labour Party in droves and incredibly active, not just on social media, on the streets, in the ballot box. It's completely changed. So I think a lot of it, I don't know enough about Belgium to say whether this is the context here, but I think an awful lot is about what people see and hear on their TV and radio. And if all they see and hear is the same politicians of different colours saying the same thing that doesn't speak to them, then why would you be political?
Interesting. So any more questions from the audience for our panel? No?
Oh, there is one.
Go ahead.
I'd like to know, excuse me, I'd like to know what the panel thinks about the increasing consolidation of the media industry, where in many countries we see that TV stations, radio stations, the main newspapers are all controlled by a small number of media moguls, media conglomerates. how does that affect the voices of resistance? Does it make it more difficult to be heard, or maybe people lose faith in mainstream media because of that, so that maybe opens a channel for resistance?
This feels like a question for Justin in the first place, who's written a book about this very topic, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, media ownership is, I think, it's still a major concern. And I think, in some ways, the obvious answer to your question is both. That both the consolidation of media ownership clearly acts to inhibit diversity and voices of resistance, but also creates opportunities outside of it. I think, there was a great anecdote in 2014 by someone called Peter Oborne, who was a right-wing journalist, political editor of first the Daily Mail, then the Telegraph, who resigned publicly because he was not allowed to report on the scandal embroiling HSBC Bank at the time and the tax avoidance and tax evasion schemes that they had been involved in. And the reason why he wasn't allowed to report on it because they happened to have one of the biggest advertising accounts with the newspaper. But one of the things that he said in his resignation letter, which I think really does illuminate the nature of the problem today, is that across the mainstream press, there is a growing concern to be careful with the line, right? And I've seen this talking to BBC journalists in my research as well. There is this growing climate of caution whereby people are scared of their boss not liking what they're writing about. They're scared of what advertisers might say. They're scared of potential libel action. And I think all of that climate of caution is always intensified by consolidation. When you get, because people, for one thing, are more scared for their jobs. Journalists are more scared for their jobs. So I think, in terms of voices of resistance, it inhibits in that respect, but obviously does create opportunities. So the more narrow the agenda has become within mainstream media, the more open to challenge it has been, particularly in the Twitter sphere and other social media platforms. And we've seen the rise of the so-called leftist alternative press very acutely in recent years. But one of the kind of odd things about all of this is just the what I'd call the bubble effect. So we had a story in the UK recently which was originated with the Sun newspaper, which basically suggested that Jeremy Corbyn was a kind of Soviet informant, that he had apparently had meetings with a Czechoslovakian spy in the 1980s, etc., which was comprehensively debunked, right? So, sources came forward, very, very sort of authoritative sources came forward, that of course he wasn't in any way an informant, and the whole thing was kind of ridiculed and mocked on Twitter sphere, and it looked like it spectacularly backfired, right? But that's just the point. It looked like it's spectacularly backfired to someone like me, right? Based on my social media feed, based on the news sources that I choose to access, right? But actually, if you look at the media that have the greatest exposure to the British voting public, and I'm talking not just the BBC as a whole, but the prime time BBC bulletins on television that reach several times, 10 times the audience that any of its more kind of specialist news programs reach. If you look at what was put out through there, if you look at what was put out through national newspapers that still have an incredibly deep reach into the public psyche, well, none of that debunking was a story. The story was the original story.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's in small countries it's a huge problem as well, or even bigger. And it's not only that the owners, the oligarchs, which are mainly, if it's domestic owners, oligarchs that they would manipulate the news, or they would kind of impose to the journalists what they have to write. Some publications are more manipulated, some are not manipulated at all. Then there is also another danger that they are going to sell it to anybody, and so on. And there are cases where journalists found a solution and tried to get used the audience that they have to pay for the content. So probably with the time, this is going to look like one of the few solutions that really works. And if it works in such a small market like the Slovakian market, where you have a new publication, where the journalists just refused and left the newspaper they worked for many years, because it was bought by an oligarchic group, and founded a new publication which is only based by subscriptions. They have advertisement only as an added thing, not calculated. And I think it's not, yes, there are several publications like this in Europe too, so that it's probably one feasible way to resist, to get used that people have to pay for the content. And it seems to work, at least in one small country for one newspaper publication. So that in a bigger market, it could be doable even more.
Well, of course, corporations, they buy media because he who controls the information controls the future. So it's only the beginning. They will start buying states, governments. But we know that. So it only means we have to try harder to resist. And they're not going to make it easier for us. They're going to make it more difficult, but we have to adapt. And we have to try harder.
Okay. Yes, there's a question over there, and yeah, the microphone is behind you. No, it's because otherwise the people at the back cannot hear you.
It's a question for you all. We talk about democracy, we talk about populism, and I think 2 years ago I listened on the Belgian television, somebody gave the definition from democracy as a dictature of average. And my question to you all is, are you agree with that?
Is democracy a dictatorship of averages?
Of average.
Of average.
Average.
Average, I see. Yeah.
It's a difficult question to throw at the panel.
I mean, I think that is very much related to what academics sometimes call the so-called liberal realists, who said that you can't have real grassroots democracies in post-industrial advanced capitalist societies mainly because actually most people just wouldn't have the time or the access to information to be able to make genuinely informed decisions and participating in democratic deliberation in that way. I guess that's what the dictatorship of the average is touching upon. But I think that I just think there's too many examples of both in history and in contemporary context of societies that do it better, where there is more democracy, where there is a more plural media. I mean, the other thing to say about democracy is, of course, democracy depends not just on access to the ballot box. It does, which is really the kind of precept of our discussion today, depends on access to plural, diverse, and accurate information. But I think too often the failures of our media or the limits of our media are just used as a kind of excuse to say, well, of course we can't have real democracy, and of course we can't have whatever it is, systems of proportional representation, as we don't have in the UK, because it would just create chaos, or we can't have plebiscites or referenda, etc. But you know, I think that it's too much of an easy way out.
Yeah, I think it's right. Democracy killed Socrates, after all, the average. Yeah, so even if the first minute we want to say, "Oh no," but it's until we will be there will be things that will be absolutely clear to us, like that this is not the dictatorship of the majority, which all Trump, like whatever on the milder Trumps and softer Trumps, try to convince us that it is about the majority. Once it is the rule, or once it is the rule of the majority, it's not democracy anymore. Democracy is only majority plus minority, or minorities, whatever minorities there is. Otherwise, sooner or later, there will be no freedom for the majority neither. And yes, there should be. This is the time where we live, in which we live now, where it is important to know that there should be things that are not to debate about. Which sounds like kind of opposing freedom of expression and freedom of press. But to me, it's very important that, like we would not like to live in a society where some things are become subjects to debate about, and this is what we're witnessing now, where we think that democracy about that we are going to debate whether human rights are okay and so on and so on. And there must be something that we are absolutely certain about, and we are obliged to tell it. In Slovakia at the moment, media have a huge responsibility, because they became, after all these events, very, very influential. So that the responsibility of media, or media is maybe a too narrow word, of whoever has the power to reach and to be heard, to reach people and to be heard. It's just that something are absolutely not to discuss about.
I feel a return of the word decency under, you don't mention it, but again, let's not question the common decency of human rights and democracy. I think that we are out of time, and I wonder if that isn't a good final statement to end with. You know, we have had amplification, we must try harder, we've had the return of decency, and I think that's enough for us to go home with. Thank you all very much, and thank you to the panelists. You all go and see Live magazine next. It's very much worth going to.